PPE, personal protective equipment. We've heard so much about it in the last 8 months, but what is the cost to produce it? And what does it mean for your money? I'm Kelsey Rollinson, and with us to understand what's behind the equipment critical in lessening the spread of the coronavirus pandemic is Peter Whitby, CEO of O2 Industries, Dr. Peter Merrick, and TheStreet's Catherine Ross. So Dr. Peter, tell us exactly what is PPE?
So PPE stands for personal protective equipment. That encompasses a very wide range of products, particularly in the medical world. Where we're most focused on is in respiratory protection. So there's been a lot of discussion of late around masks. We specifically make respirators, which are different than masks in that they're designed to filter the air that people breathe to minimize the amount of contaminated air that they're bringing into their lungs. Unlike masks, which are predominantly designed to collect people's respiratory droplets. And so masks are more designed to protect other people from the person who's wearing the mask, whereas a respirator is more designed to protect the person who's wearing the device from inhaling anything in the air, which could be anything from air pollution to infectious droplets to allergens or smoke or other things along those lines.
And when we think of the mask, just to clarify for some people, it's mostly what we see those surgical masks that come in packs of 10 or 20, the blue and white, those kinds of things that go around the ear. That is what you're saying really protects the droplets from coming from me to someone else, rather than a respirator that would actually protect me from aerosols that are coming in from other people. Are those sort of the differentiators that you, because so many people are making these masks these days on Etsy and designers just to differentiate how people can tell the difference between a mask and a respirator?
Precisely. And that's not to say that masks don't offer the person who's wearing it some value, because they absolutely do. And sometimes they do in ways that are less than obvious initially. For example, we're told constantly these days not to touch our face, and I think we all are acutely aware of how often we touch our face. And so masks can stop you from putting things in your nose and mouth, but they do offer some protection against inhaled droplets, but their main purpose is mostly to protect other people from the person who's wearing them by collecting their expired respiratory droplets.
We know there are many different uses for PPE, and of course, most recently the focus has been on the masks. There's also gowns, goggles, that sort of thing. How effective are they in stopping the spread of the disease?
Well, so that sort of breaks off into a number of different areas. For frontline healthcare workers, of which I myself am one of them, they're essential to protect us from getting infected ourselves. And so as we knew when the pandemic really became a global phenomena, we knew that there was a short supply, and we knew supply chain was going to be a problem there, which is how I ended up connecting with O2 here in Canada. When it comes to masks, they're very important. If everybody's wearing a mask, they're very effective at stopping people from spreading those droplets to other people. But you can imagine, say, for example, I'm an emergency physician. If I'm intubating a patient, or if I'm dealing with a patient who's confused and combative, or a young child, they're not going to be wearing a mask themselves. So in situations like that, often frontline healthcare workers require additional protection, and that's where respirators come in, and they're essential for protecting us.
And of course, in the current environment, we hear PPE, and of course, we think of COVID, but PPE has existed for decades and is uses that extend far beyond the current pandemic. And Peter, I can bring you in on this one because you can speak to some of those applications, from helping consumers breathe clean air amid wildfires and other things like pollution. In fact, that's how you got started in founding this company to begin with. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So O2 Industries was founded in 2014 after a trip to China. I mean, here in North America and Canada and US, we breathe beautiful clean air every day. But, you know, if you've ever been to Southeast Asia and experienced, you know, severe smog or air pollution, it's really eye-opening. And that's kind of the genesis for O2, where we came back and really started studying, you know, what is air pollution? How do you protect yourself from that? And in North America and in the US and Canada, we see, you know, PPE and masks used in factories, in industrial, and obviously needed, you know, out west right now in the forest fires. California, Washington, British Columbia are just dealing with severe air pollution. So these are kind of use cases where you would need a mask or something actually more than that, a respirator in North America.
And Catherine, I want to bring you in a little bit at this point to give us some idea of when you started noticing companies really shifting to following and looking into PPE, because you've been following this so closely in terms of the investment front that a lot of companies were looking at in manufacturing. When did it really become on the radar of so many companies to sort of look at this as something that was going to be a very important thing moving forward?
This really started happening back in late December, early January, that we heard a lot of companies worry about China, where they were shutting down the manufacturing facilities. One time I noticed Apple talk about it, but back then it was kind of known as pneumonia. And from then on, up until March, we were kind of hearing more and more about masks becoming more important in Asia, but it wasn't happening in the US. And in fact, we really weren't told to wear masks on purpose. I interviewed Dr. Fauci earlier this summer, and he told me that public officials had decided not to inform the public due to the shortage of N95 respirator masks and the panic that could have been ensued had everyone realized that they needed to get a mask in order to protect themselves. So it's really from March onwards that you've seen this kind of rush for US companies and consumers to really hop on the mask train, whether it's from producing masks to wearing masks.
And Peter, when did you notice for your company that was obviously already in the business of creating PPE, the respirators, that you should focus or shift the attention over to COVID? Obviously, you've been working in the air pollution space and for other areas for like pollution and wildfires and giving out respirators to those on the front lines of those situations. But when did you really start noticing that COVID would be something that your company's product could really move into quite quickly?
Yeah, so I became very aware of COVID on January 20th. So on that date, the Chinese government announced the transmission of the virus from human to human. And literally the next day here in North America, on the 21st, we sold out of product. So we were aware that this was a global issue on January 21st. And so just to be clear, a lot of those purchasers were from Hong Kong and from Asia. And basically they just purchased our entire stock. So end of January is where we really saw a shortage of PPE and a shortage of respirators.
And Dr. Peter, just at this point, I'd love to get your opinion on how consumers and even companies, if they're looking into investing in this area, can tell the difference between what's really a quality-made respirator or mask or something that they should not be looking into. How do you know whether it's something is a worthwhile investment in the real protective qualities that you told us earlier that are necessary if you're going to stop the spread of this disease?
So when you're thinking of masks and respirators, both of them are up to different standards around the world. And that's one of the first problems that we noticed as we ran out of supply in North America. We were trying to import standards from different parts of the world. So for example, what a lot of people have heard about, and I think Catherine mentioned earlier, was the idea of N95 masks. Those are actually respirators. So even though it's a disposable mask, an N95 is actually a respirator. It's designed to filter air, and it's designed to form an airtight seal to your face. There was a quick run on those products around the world, and then so we tried to import products from other parts of the world that have similar sort of uses, and we found that often they didn't meet, they just weren't fit for purpose. And that's exactly how I got involved with O2, because we were very short on supplies of respirators at the time, and so I started looking at the products that O2 was creating, and I started doing research in terms of the clinical applications, and that's how we teamed up together. The key issues, if you think about a respirator, is it has two qualities. It needs to filter air very, very efficiently, and then it has to form an airtight seal to the face. So even if you have an exceptional respirator with an exceptional filter, if you don't have a good seal to your face, it's effectively an expensive mask. And so if you're not forcing air in through the filter, and if it's able to escape around other parts of it, then you're not going to get the same level of protection that you would otherwise have with a properly mask fit tested respirator. And so masks, again, come in a number of different varieties. And as I said earlier, they were predominantly from a protection point of view to protect other people, but they have fluid penetration requirements they require. And so if you look at those qualities, you want to see that people have actually done the testing that's required on these. And the testing is very, very extensive. It's not an easy space to just jump into. And there's a huge backlog of those testing facilities around the world right now as people are trying to pivot into that space.
Yeah, certainly giving O2 Industries an advantage there, already being in the space. But Catherine, let's talk about the market a little bit. There are some estimates that say the PPE market will reach $33.4 billion globally, up from just about $12.9 billion in 2019. So when we look at that, and you've been talking to so many companies that are looking to invest in this space, what are really some of the things that they are looking at? I know that supply chain has also been a difficult thing. Some winners and losers here in this space. What are you hearing as you're talking to so many out there that are now confronted with this new opportunity and place for innovation?
So supply chain is definitely an issue. I mean, the N95 respirator masks that we've talked about, the filter is a tiny plastic filter and requires tiny plastic beads in order to be melted down and to create that filter. Those plastic beads are in high demand right now for obvious reasons. That means that, for example, 3M, GE, they're struggling to keep up with the demand for the N95, which has opened up kind of this manufacturing hole that we have to fill. So I've spoken to CEOs such as the CEO of Lidl, which got a grant from the DoD, $12 million grant in order to up their production of the melt-blown filters that are needed for these kinds of respirator masks. So it's all about trying to move this manufacturing production that has been up until this year largely done in China and in other places back to the US. And there's kind of an issue of in this kind of economic environment, can manufacturing facilities afford this shift? And how do we properly fund them?
As a consumer looking to maybe invest in this space, Catherine, what should they be really looking at in some of the companies you mentioned? Lidl and also 3M is a big player, Honeywell. What are they looking at right now, and what should they be watching for in these companies as they pivot it more into this space?
Well, right now you want to look at how much of that production is the company devoting, and also how much money are they putting in? Are they getting grants from the DoD or the government? Are they spending their own money, and will they be making that money back? It's all about the balance sheet here, and you really want to be able to eye those parts of the business, but also perhaps look at the larger balance sheet. Look at how they're doing outside of PPE, because you want a well-balanced portfolio, and that comes from looking at the basic balance sheet.
And Peter, tell us a little bit about how your company, obviously it was a company that was involved with PPE ahead of the coronavirus. How have you adapted to meet the growing demands amid this pandemic, recognizing that you're not only trying to meet demands of today, but it's certainly on the radar now of consumers, hospitals, companies to have these PPE products on hand and sort of in supply so nobody gets caught flat-footed again?
Yeah, absolutely. With COVID coming, there's just been extreme demand. So O2 has really handled this by scaling production massively. So we're investing in manufacturing not only in Canada, in the US and China. So we really want to diversify that supply chain, what Catherine talked about. You know, transportation, shipping fees are so expensive right now. And we even had the example of the Canada and the US border closing down. So we really wanted to diversify our manufacturing and set up so that we can supply our customers worldwide. Additionally, innovation is critical here. If you look at the masks that most people are wearing, really not much has changed in 100 years from 1919, from the Spanish flu. So, it's almost embarrassing, or it's this opportunity to really innovate and help people breathe clean air. So O2 is investing heavily in production, heavily in our supply chain, and heavily in just producing the best respirators in the world. That's where we're focused.
All right, and Catherine, I just want to bring you in quickly again on that topic that he touched on, that supply chain and or in manufacturing, how so much had been outsourced to China before this, and then when all states, government, companies, people needed all this product, it was really difficult to get a hold of. So, talk a little bit about the companies that you're talking to who are now really readjusting where they're getting their PPE from or where they're manufacturing, so it's not so focused on one country.
So I spoke to the CEO of Lidl earlier this week, and one thing that she told me, they manufacture the melt-blown filters. Now, one thing that she mentioned to me was how no one could have seen this coming. So in the past couple of years, it's been easier to shift that production overseas. And as soon as this kind of pandemic hits, something that we couldn't really see coming, the speed in which you have to shift back is just not possible. So starting to move this production back to the US is key in order to keep the supply chain from being as fragmented as we saw earlier on in this pandemic.
And Peter, do increased sales outweigh the rising costs of the production costs that you need as you're ramping this up? And also, I know that your company has in the past been very involved in donating some respirators to frontline rescuers in the firefighting industry and other things like that. So how do you weigh all that with your bottom line, doing all of that and ramping this up at the same time?
Yeah, that's a lot. But with COVID, it certainly has helped the bottom line. There's just extreme demand right now, so that certainly has benefited the business and the bottom line. That being said, altruistic, running our business properly and trying to help people breathe clean air is at the core of what we do. The very first respirators we had in 2017, we took out to California and British Columbia to donate, and certainly we're trying to do our best in this situation as well. You also have developing countries dealing with COVID, and getting respirators there is critical. So that's just kind of a foundational piece to O2. On the business side, we feel that our reusable respirator, actually our customers kind of get a payback really quickly, and it benefits them as well. So, there's a lot to deal with selling a respirator in a pandemic, but we're certainly doing our best and trying to help as many people as we can.
And on this same topic, Dr. Peter, do you think people are as aware as they should be of air quality of where they live? I mean, certainly we've seen in certain parts of this country, certainly out west, the air quality deteriorate quite significantly with the wildfires, but of course that spreads in inner cities and things like that. We hadn't really been focused that much on it before. So in addition to a pandemic where people have to go into office buildings and their circulation, but even just in general everyday life, are people as concerned about the health of the air quality they're breathing? And is this something that you think will be a real concern in the health space going forward?
I think 2020 will absolutely mark a time when this has become front and center about what we're thinking about. And I can say for myself, it absolutely was as well. Interestingly enough, I was in Australia at the beginning of the year. I landed there, I think, on January 1st during the enormous wildfires that they had at the time, and Sydney was basically blanketed in smoke at the time. And I'd not seen anything like it before, and I lived in Australia for many years. And then when I came home, the next issue about air quality was the issue of the pandemic and the idea of being able to have appropriate protection in terms of avoiding inhaled droplets. And so the World Health Organization itself estimates 9 out of 10 people on the planet are breathing contaminated air on a regular basis. And so I think a lot more people are aware of this issue. We've seen it where people have been hit on a number of levels. We've seen it with the pandemic in terms of infectious droplets. We've seen it with air quality in terms of forest fires. We're aware of it from an industrial pollution point of view. And so when you start looking at all those things together, I think people are now really starting to think about that issue and looking at ways that they can appropriately protect themselves when they need to. It's no longer just a niche thing that's in industry, but it's actually something that people on a regular basis are thinking about more and more.
And it's interesting, I'd love to bring in just quickly the sports world too here on this, because as we all know, a lot of America kind of really sat up and took notice of COVID-19 when the commissioner of basketball, Adam Silver, canceled the season in mid-March, earlier than really any other league. And it was such a big wake-up call for so many as to how quickly this virus was spreading. Dr. Peter, talk to us a little bit about what professional athletes should be wearing in terms of respirators or masks, and also just everyday people when they're involved in sports. There's a lot of talk about, non-professional schools and stuff going back to playing in this environment. What should people know?
Well, so what we've found for us is that when we think about air quality now, there's a number of different things you may want to protect yourself against, and that offers enormous opportunity to pivot with what we do in terms of filtration, depending on what it is that we're hoping to protect against. Obviously, there's always a balance between trying to filter as efficiently as possible and having the best amount of breathability in terms of what you're wearing on your face. There are athletes that have had to wear masks in order to be able to compete, and I think a great example of that is American medalist, Olympic medalist, was Galen Rupp. And he won, I believe, both a silver and a bronze medal at the Olympics. And at times his allergies are so severe that he actually wears a respirator effectively, which improves his performance dramatically because he's actually able to breathe. I can speak with Peter here. We've just signed a partnership deal with the UFC, which was one of the first sports organizations to open up in terms of trying to get athletes back. And so we're now in collaboration with them to exactly do that, trying to find appropriate respirators and masks for their athletes. I'll let Peter touch on that as well.
Yeah, so Kelsey, we're working with the UFC. I mean, MMA is hand-to-hand combat, and these athletes are some of the toughest on earth, and they really can't go to the gym right now. So they can't go to the gym, they can't train, they can't work together, and essentially that's a major issue. So we're working with them to provide them with protection when they're traveling, and then we're also collaborating with them to engineer a new respirator that would help them get back to the gym. So going back to that innovation piece and really creating something that's very breathable, a good seal, and protecting them while functioning in that unique sport where they operate.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see how you at O2 Industries have innovated so much in this space. And Catherine, for companies who did shift to PPE production during the pandemic, who are the real winners and losers?
Well, let's talk about a little bit about sports, for example. Right now, you saw both Nike and Under Armour release their own kind of sports masks. And those, when you're looking at the broad range of items that they sell, that could be considered a win right then and there, because you're offering people something that they need, while also, for example, I can hop on Nike's website, I can get that new yoga outfit that I wanted and the mask to pair with it so I can go safely exercise outside. Then there's also 3M, which is an obvious one that we've been talking about over and over and over again because of the N95 and KN95 masks. And of course, Honeywell, which is another industrial company. You're going to want to look for companies that are not solely invested in PPE production, just because this industry may not be there 5 to 10 years down the line, but you're going to want to look at companies that have focused on this industry while also offering a wide variety of different items.
Yeah, I'm about to say my 10-year-old son has a Nike mask, so it does have an impact, certainly. And we also have to look at companies who are having to provide PPE for their employees, where before they didn't. So what do you see as the rising PPE costs, and what does that mean for the bottom line for some of these companies?
The rise in PPE costs could be detrimental to some companies, but when you think about it, protecting your employees is so crucial right now that it might actually pay out. So let's take a company like Target or Walmart, for example. Now, I'm just using these as broad examples because when you walk in, these employees are wearing masks. Same with restaurants, for example. You want to protect those employees and you want to protect your customers and your consumers, because otherwise you're opening yourself up for a possible lawsuit, because we just don't know what's going to go on, what legal actions can be taken as this pandemic continues. So the bottom line here is protecting yourself, protecting your employees, and protecting your consumers is going to pay out in the long run.
Yeah, and Peter, I know in just developing your PPE, you took a lot of care in the look of it. It's almost a fashionable item, as opposed to, as you said, what we were used to for the past 100 years is those blue masks. So from a business standpoint, talk about what that is, how important that is for you and your company, and how much you put into really the look of what you're selling, and not just obviously the effectiveness of as being a respirator that could protect people.
Yeah, certainly the look of a mask or respirator is critical. It's worn on your face. It's the most important part of your image in many ways. So we focus on function first, science. It has to work really well and protect you. And then secondly, how do we get rid of that stigma of wearing a respirator? So we offer customizable front shells, so different colors that can match your outfit, and we have more coming. We have multiple strap variations. So we have an ear loop strap where it doesn't mess up with women with longer hair or guys with longer hair. So that customizable aspect to it is something that is important, and you're going to see growing as time evolves. And masks and respirators are with us to stay.
Right. Well, we're going to shift a little bit into the investing in PPE. And before we talk about the specifics of that, I'd love to hear from Dr. Peter about what specifications should you think someone should care about when they're analyzing a company and what the product that they're making. What product would really, what qualifications should they make sure that that company is hitting before they would invest in a company, that in terms of the health protections that it would give somebody in the product that they're making?
So you want to make sure that they're testing and that they're meeting the standards of the regions that they're going into. So we mentioned the N95 and the KN95 that was talked about earlier. We've been actively working with Health Canada to create a new standard for respiratory protection here in Canada, specifically for the medical world, because what we're finding is that the protection that one needs, for example, in a mining or construction situation is not exactly the same as the protection one might need, for example, in healthcare or in agricultural purposes or for air pollution. So there's an opportunity there to look at what those standards are. But you want to make sure that it's science that's driving what they're doing. There's a lot of people that are making claims that they think things work really well. People talk about having masks with a certain type of filter, but if that mask doesn't have a good seal to your face, then it's really not a respirator in any stretch of the imagination. So you want to be making sure that people are meeting those regulations, that they're working towards them, and you want to make sure that they're doing the science first.
And Catherine, you've been talking to so many people in the investment community. What qualities do you think an investor should be looking for? What do they say from your reporting that investors should be looking for in a PPE producing company before they take that step?
I mean, again, it's a lot of diversification. That's going to be the key here, because you don't want a company that's just PPE. You want to look at a company, for example, Etsy. You want to look at companies that are very heavily focused on this space right now, as it's so important to so many consumers and to just the economy. But you want to ensure that this investment, if you're going for a long-term investment, it's going to still be here down the line.
And many people hear PPE and think it's not perhaps worth investing in, because if, for example, there is a vaccine found soon, that it may not be needed anymore, that these respirators and masks will fall by the wayside. Do you think that's the case?
Look, PPE is here to stay for the time being, even if we get a vaccine. I've got so many friends that tell me, I've got 2 or 3 masks, is that enough? And I would say actually probably not. Let's take a look at this vaccine timeline, for example. Right now, we've been hearing a lot about a potential emergency use authorization from the FDA for a vaccine candidate by November, but that's looking, according to the experts I've spoken to, ever and ever more unlikely, especially because of the AstraZeneca trial being put on halt. Now, the reason being is that we want to make sure that the American public trusts this vaccine. Right now, not many do. So what might happen is that a company that has a vaccine candidate might seek emergency use authorization from the FDA by the end of this year, early next year. But then think about this. You have to put out that vaccine candidate to the healthcare workers, to the front line. We don't quite know from the government who comes first, but it's going to take months to not only produce that vaccine, and production has already started for some. It's going to take months to produce that vaccine, get it to the frontline workers, to get it to the tiered system that they're talking about at the CDC, and then to move into the general public. So until then, masks are here to stay, and there's an additional problem here. Well, not problem, but there's an additional layer to the issues here of the vaccines are aiming for a 50% effectiveness. Now, that actually could point that we're going to be wearing masks for the long term.
Dr. Peter, do you want to jump in on this point of whether or not people will be wearing masks even after a vaccine is distributed, and also a little bit about what consumers and investors should know about a vaccine process and how long that actually can take and the ups and downs that are involved?
I would agree with Catherine in that regard, because getting a vaccine out to the general public for a new virus that we've never seen before takes a very, very long time. We've been trying to do it with coronaviruses. Now, this is one coronavirus. We've been dealing with coronaviruses for a very long period of time. We don't yet have a commercially available coronavirus vaccine for any of them. I'm not saying that that's not going to happen, because we have some of the best and brightest minds around the world working on that issue. But the idea that it's going to be readily available anytime before the election, I think, is extremely optimistic and downright unlikely. So therefore, the idea that people are going to be wearing personal protective equipment, it's likely that that's going to be happening for a long time. And I can tell you, in the healthcare space, once something becomes the new standard of care, it's unlikely we're going to go back to what we did before. You know, if you look throughout the history of as we've made these improvements in safety, whether it comes to things as simple as washing your hands, wearing rubber gloves, wearing surgical masks, these are all things that we did over time. Now that this has become the new standard of care, I will never go back to intubating patients again without a respirator on my face. Because we don't know when the next thing is going to come as well. We've seen pandemics happening more and more rapidly as we become a more global society, so things spread around the world very, very quickly. And so as a result, I think that now that it's become the new standard of care, certainly in healthcare, it's unlikely that that's going to be going away anytime soon.
And Peter, I'll bring you in here before we move on from this too. And you know, when people say, well, they may have a vaccine, we won't need these anymore. For somebody who founded a company making PPE before COVID even existed, what do you tell those people in terms of what you're doing in terms of innovating in this space?
Yeah, so O2 Industries has 3 new respirators that we're developing right now, and we'll have out, actually our new respirator, the TR2, is launching in October, which is more for police and military. But on the consumer side, we've got 2 new respirators in the works that we'll have out early next year. Additionally, just touching on what Dr. Peter had talked about is culture, right? We're now accustomed to wearing masks. Catherine has 2 masks. Most of us, have a couple. This is kind of learned behavior now. One example I look back to is in Hong Kong when SARS hit. That was a society that didn't really wear masks before. And now, even pre-COVID, it was very common to wear a mask on the metro in Hong Kong. I know Dr. Peters talked a lot about it in Taiwan as well. So it's just culture. Are we really ever going to go on a plane again without your masks? It just seems crazy, right?
I know, as difficult as that is to believe, right? We all are living in such a new environment, and it's unknown as to how long it will continue. But Catherine, obviously there are other disruptors coming into this space. Is it easy to spot unknown companies selling masks? On Instagram or Etsy, we see these coming out, but what signs should investors look for to spot an up-and-coming disruptor? From your reporting, what is really on the radar from a lot of these investors when they're looking into getting into this space?
So this is kind of a difficult space because a lot of these companies have just popped up in the past couple of months, right? A lot of entrepreneurs are seeing this opportunity and they're seizing on it. And it's become kind of like the vaccine space, actually. They're kind of comparable where you're seeing a lot of companies come in. You may or may not know them. They might be big player names, but they might also be like a Moderna, which actually has never done a vaccine before, and look at where it is now. It's one of the top vaccine candidates that we're eyeing. So you're seeing these companies on Instagram pop up, and some might have 1,000 followers and might still be making a ton of orders, but some might have 100,000 followers, and you just don't know whether or not this space will allow for them to become the next 3M. So it's all about eyeing what kind. It goes back again to the balance sheet. You want to look at the sales that they're making, and the issue then comes, it's private companies. How many investors can really afford to invest in a private company? So we're going to continue to eye this space, and I would say right now, just keep your eye out.
And Dr. Peter, outside of masks, where should people be looking as far as what companies are producing that might be another area of interest? Because obviously, as a doctor, there's gowns, there's goggles. Are these things important to anybody outside of the people on the front lines?
Well, they become increasingly important in ways that we didn't think so. So when we talked about the run on PPE or personal protective equipment, at one point it was a run on everything, whether it was gowns, whether it was gloves. And then you have to consider the environmental impact of that as well. One of the reasons why I wanted to work with O2 is that we're using a reusable respirator, and the impact both economically but also on the environment is significantly reduced as a result. So when you're looking at gowns, whether you're, a lot of clothing companies pivoted into that space, they started making gowns. If you look at, I don't know if anyone's been on a flight recently, but many of the airlines have basically got PPE gowns for their flight attendants. And I think AirAsia was one of the first companies to do that with full shields, gloves, and gowns. And so you're seeing that in a number of spaces where people are going to be required to be congregating together in a close environment, that they're wanting to protect their staff to the best of their ability. And so it's more than just respirators and masks. There's opportunity for growth in all of those areas.
And I know that the O2 curve provides premium respiratory protection against these micron particles. Not something that a lot of people know about. How important is that, and the level of protection that people should know about? Peter, if you want to talk about that and in developing your products, I guess it's 98.6% of particles. So tell us how you got there, developed this, and how important it is for people's health to know exactly how much the respirators they have are protecting them.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier about air pollution. So it's kind of this invisible killer, right? It's almost it's invisible to the naked eye, and you almost don't even know it's affecting you. But these extremely small particles in the micron scale actually are inhaled into your respiratory system and get into your blood system and can cause a chemical reaction. So these have really detrimental effects to the human body in long term. So you need to wear a respirator that can filter particles down to a very smaller degree. Now, I'll let Dr. Peter talk a little bit more about that filtration efficiency, but it's critical that you're filtering those extremely small particles.
And that's sort of what I touched on earlier with regard to the differences between masks and respirators, is that the whole purpose of a respirator is to force all of the air that you're going to inhale through a very efficient particle filtration system, and then make sure that you have that airtight seal on your face. And it's that combination are the two main factors. There are other things you want to look at, how it fits to your face, how long you can wear it for, whether it has exhalation valves. We talk about fluid resistance, and even one of the qualifications you need to meet is on flame retardation, so that it's not lighting up in that regard. But in terms of that small particles, not only is it effective, for example, at reducing the inhaled droplets that people may be coming into contact with, but importantly, for example, people that have severe allergies. In Australia, when I was working there was an issue, they call it thunderstorm asthma. So they believe that it's related to ryegrasses, but if there's a huge influx of, like for example, what you get with a thunderstorm, we have these massive outbreaks of asthma. And so people that suffer from that may need a respirator during those times in order to just function as a normal person, because we're seeing ICU admissions jump through the roof. So we see that air pollution is a major contributing factor around the world. And as I said earlier, the World Health Organization is really put it front and center these days as a contributing cause of death. And it's not just in the obvious ways. So you have short-term things like people who suffer from asthma or COPD, but in the longer term, there's increased risk of cardiovascular disease and even cancer and pneumonia if people are exposed to it for longer periods of time. So that filtration is extremely important to protect people.
And Peter, talk a little bit about how you got into, when you were developing this. Obviously, we heard your story about going over to China and seeing the smog and wanting to produce something. But what did it mean for your company to be right on the front lines when this all came about and people really started focusing so heavily on respirators and PPE?
Yeah, it was pretty powerful when COVID hit, and we all kind of realized in North America how important it is to breathe clean air with this respiratory disease that's airborne. It's been crazy. Our business has kind of 10x'd with revenues and the people in our company. It's really changed everything. So a lot of these things we've been working for years on creating a perfect seal and getting rid of that stigma of wearing a respirator. It's just kind of been crystallized, and we've all realized that in North America, like, hey, we've taken this for granted, but when there's a disease that's airborne, it really changes your opinion, and oh my gosh, I really need to focus on the air that I'm breathing. So it's been a game changer for O2 Industries.
And as a CEO, I'm sure when everybody else in the world was looking at getting in on this and buying materials and things like that, your manufacturing, your supplies must have shifted significantly. Tell us about how you were able to pivot and really come to meet the demand that your company, who'd been in the business, but was experiencing, just because now it really was at the forefront of what everyone else was looking at.
Yeah, so we really just focused on scaling as quickly as we could. We were fortunate enough to be in the business and have those relationships, right? So a lot of these little companies trying to get into the space and procure that melt-blown material that Catherine talked about, it's simply impossible. Good luck. You're not going to get into it until next year. This is, we're at the forefront of it, and we're scaling as quickly as we can right now.
Catherine, tell us a little bit about that supply chain. I know you've been talking to a lot of companies that have had that difficulty. So what does it mean for new businesses trying to get in this space? As we just heard, it's a difficult thing to get a hold of some of these materials.
Well, based on my reporting with companies already in the space, I would imagine it's going to be quite difficult. I mean, the shortage here is massive. And to try to move into a space where there's so many players shifting, it's kind of like playing a game of chess where you're not going to be able to, land that win. So I would say that really right now, a lot of these companies are focusing not so much on the respirators that we've been talking about, because those especially are very hard to create. Instead, they're going to be focusing more on the cloth masks, how they can make those effective and deliver those to consumers.
And Dr. Peter, give us a little bit more background on how you got involved in this area with O2 Industries and why it's so important to collaborate with a company making these devices for those people like yourself who are on the front lines.
Well, when I returned to Canada from Australia back at the end of February, it was actually the day that I flew back was the day that we had declared COVID as a pandemic around the world. But I had been watching it unfold whilst I was working in Australia for a couple of months. And I knew immediately at that point that supply chain was going to become an issue. So I began looking for companies within North America and specifically within Canada that were making respirators, because we found that that was the biggest area that we were having difficulty with. So I came to Waterloo and I met with the people here at O2 Canada, and we began working on looking at the product that they had already created, which was the O2 Curve, and to seeing whether we could test to see if that would be appropriate for medical purposes. And that's sort of how that research began. So I started taking it to my colleagues and at the hospitals at the university that I work at, and we began putting it through its paces. And as a result, we realized that there was an opportunity here to really innovate in this space because there was a way to make sure that we could do this that was more sustainable, more economical. So you can imagine with the supply chain issues that Catherine spoke to earlier, not only do we talk about that you need to have a mask that filters of a certain efficiency, but you will be mask fit tested. Every healthcare worker, for example, is mask fit tested every 2 years to a specific type of mask. And if you run out of that mask, then the hospital then has to mask fit test everyone else once again. And so as things are running out, as that supply chain is dwindling around the world, it became a huge difficult undertaking to keep people protected appropriately. So we were looking at finding a way to do that in a way that was more sustainable, and that's how I ended up partnering with O2 Canada.
That's great. And Peter, if you could talk a little bit about moving forward, obviously with all these new players in this space, how are you continuing to develop your product and innovate while other people are sort of now so focused on, in some ways, being competition for you? It's obviously probably more people than had been there 8 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real focus on this marketplace right now. Firstly, hardware is hard, so a lot of these new players are really going to encounter the challenge of building a respirator. So that's one advantage, is that these products take a lot of time to develop. There's a lot of engineering, tooling, and manufacturing involved, so it's really quite difficult. But we've been innovating for a number of years now. So our new product, our new respirator we're launching in October, called the Tactical Respirator, we've been working on it for 2 years. So we've really never stopped innovating. We've also, since the pandemic has hit, really focused on a medical respirator that Dr. Peter has been incredible in assisting us in and really understanding that use case, right? So we've just got the right people on our team in order to innovate. And on top of that, focusing on intellectual property. So filing IP, developing new IP, and taking that very seriously, and having a track record of that is going to be critical as we look to grow the company.
And tell us a little bit more about this product in October. How is that different from what you have been putting out right now, and the improvements that you said you spent the last 2 years in the innovation of this new product? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so 2 years ago, we were actually approached by the Canadian Armed Forces, and they're just soldiers are dealing with lead poisoning. So they're firing so many rounds of ammunition that their lead levels are going up, they get really sick and they can't go to work. And we've learned that this is an issue with soldiers worldwide. So we started working with them and working with soldiers specifically in engineering a product that they can look and feel and do their job while also protecting themselves from lead inhalation. So I'm just going to quickly show you that. It looks very different than any mask or respirator you've ever seen, kind of Bane-like. It's really aggressive. But first and foremost, it protects the wearer and helps them from lead. And I know Dr. Peter can speak on the dangers of that, but basically to bring this respirator to market, it's been 2 years of R&D and manufacturing.
Dr. Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this new product that's going to be launching?
Certainly. So that was a project that sort of was going on with O2 before I was involved, and I was very interested in getting involved and specifically about a medical respirator, and so we've been working on that. And we should be close to launching that very shortly. But then I became involved with the tactical respirator as well, making sure that it was, getting all the final approvals on it. Really, what people were finding in the military is that soldiers were actually suffering from lead poisoning because they were firing off so many rounds and they were inhaling. Like you said, we haven't been thinking about this for such a long period of time, that they were inhaling lead particles on a regular basis. And I believe I wasn't involved in this specific study, but I think they found that they were not only dealing with lead themselves, but they were actually starting to pass it on to their own families. And so that became a concern. I think you can speak to that, Peter.
While they're practicing, on the range, they need to be wearing adequate respiratory protection. And it's just something that they told us basically they were, going to Home Depot and just buying, masks off the shelf. Well, that doesn't fit with the job that they have to do. And so more thinking and strategy and engineering needs to go into protecting soldiers and protecting other professionals as well.
And I'll speak to that as well. This year in the United States, the number one cause of death for police officers has actually been COVID. So being able to protect police officers with respiratory protection is an important part of what they do. And those situations can obviously become very, very quickly escalating. We've also had issues of people being, there's been an issue with fentanyl for the last few years that's become increasingly a problem. And if that becomes airborne, there have been cases where people have reacted to that. So there's different reasons why one might need respiratory protection, and I think we're starting to realize that more and more.
And Dr. Peter, talk a little bit about that, because early on in this pandemic, there was a real concern that people on the front lines, especially in the healthcare industry, could not get their hands on enough of the PPE if everybody started buying it. So as a company, how do you sort of manage that or get involved in that in any way so that your products are obviously available to everybody, consumers, but also that you sort of make sure that the ones that are medical grade and needed on the front lines get there as well?
Well, that's exactly how I began working with O2, is to answer that exact question. I was literally just a customer looking for personal protective equipment for myself and my staff. And we noticed that there was a number of counterfeit products that were out there. We saw that we had shipments blocked at the border, and so with all those supply chain issues, I looked to try and find a different solution. There was a number of us in that space looking at 3D printing things. Other people were, retrofitting snorkel devices and other things to see if they could try and solve that problem. And I met with this company, and we decided to look at what their product was right there. So the goal was, that, like we said, the O2 curve wasn't initially designated as a healthcare device, and it's been that research and development that we've done over the last 6 months to try and pivot into that space to make sure that it is available to everyone that needs it. By having a reusable respirator, and so the word that you may hear about is something called an elastomeric respirator, and so people have probably seen them. The typical designation for that is a P100, and they usually have large valves, large filters on either side of them, and they've become increasingly adopted in the healthcare world. But we're trying to find a solution that allows people to be able to use them in a number of clinical situations, but not only that, they're protecting the person who's wearing it themselves, but making sure that they're not cross-contaminating amongst their colleagues or other patients. And so we've kind of designed it from the ground up to look at how we're making sure that we have that available to everyone. But if you have a reusable respirator, the burn rate of your personal protection equipment goes down dramatically. And so there's an enormous opportunity for innovation there.
And Peter, talk a little bit about the future of O2 Industries. You're on the front lines here of developing PPE, which so many people need. You're innovating. You've got years on other companies in the products that you've already begun to roll out. So what does the future look like for you in terms of when you want people to know about O2 Industries?
Yeah, so O2 is a global company. We're on a mission to help people breathe clean air. That is ultimately what we're here to do. And we focus every single day on R&D, engineering, listening to customers, listening to these unique use cases, and trying to solve, these dangerous particles in the air. That's what we're here for. We're scaling as quickly as we can. We're bringing new respirators to market, and we're excited to become a household name.
All right. Well, Peter Whitby, Dr. Peter Merrick, and Catherine Ross, thank you so much for joining us today. And stick with TheStreet and O2 Industries as we continue to explore the coronavirus and what it means for big business. I'm Kelsey Hubbard in New York.